Hello and welcome to Resolve's Kitchen Table Conversation series. We are really excited to have you here. Our Kitchen Table series is a digital series hosted by Resolve, the National Infertility Association, and it really brings back the nostalgia of our founder, Barbara Eck, who founded Resolve in 1974 around her kitchen table. So here we are, bringing people together to have conversations that are important to our community and helping bring education to as many people as we can. So we are today talking about what happens in an embryology lab. I am Barb Calora. I am the president and CEO of Resolve, the National Infertility Association. I want to make a shout out, first of all, to our sponsors for helping support Resolve and all the work we do and this digital educational series. Our head of the table sponsor for our whole kitchen table series is Granada Bio. And then sponsoring today's episode is our guest sponsor, which is Tomorrow. So we, in the month of July, we honor and recognize embryologists through World Embryology Day. And the purpose of this observance is to shed light on the incredible professionals behind life-giving reproductive technology. We recently polled our online community to find out what questions they had that were about embryologists and what happens in the lab. And so we're going to be able to touch on some of those. I like to say behind the glass. And we'll be able to get to some of those questions as well. So we're going to unpack that and some other things that I have on my mind. Well, let's go ahead and jump right in. I have two amazing embryologists with me today. I'm going to ask each of them to tell you a little bit about themselves. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Mina Alikani. Tell us where you're coming from and a little bit about your background.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for doing everything you do at Resolve for our patients. I am a clinical embryologist, as you mentioned. I direct the fertility laboratories of Northwell Health Fertility in New York City, and my responsibilities range from staffing the laboratories, providing training, continuing education, assessing competency, to selection, maintenance of equipment, implementation of new technologies, ensuring optimal environment for eggs and sperm and embryos, to reviewing patient cycles, advising my physician colleagues on the performance of the patient in the laboratory, etc. So it's a tough job, but a very fulfilling career.
And you've been at this, you look like maybe you started when you were 10 years old, because you've been at this a while.
That's very kind.
And have been at some really incredible practices as well, like Cornell and St. Barnabas in New Jersey. So we are really honored to have you here and get into these questions. Elise, Daniel, we are also really honored to have you here. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, super excited to be here. I've known about Resolve for a long time. I've been to your walks of hope and things like that. So super excited. I always guide patients that way. There's lots of resources. But I'm an embryologist. I've been in the field almost 5 years now. And I have a background in genetics and biotechnology. And I am in the North Carolina area, but I am currently a per diem embryologist, meaning that I travel to different clinics around the country that need a little extra embryology support. And as an embryologist, we're kind of doing all things in the lab, you know, embryo freezing, embryo thawing, embryo culture, egg retrievals, egg vitrification, insemination, conventional insemination, ICSI, all of those things we're responsible for, as well as some sperm processing and things like that back in the lab.
Well, you've probably already answered a couple of our questions, both of you, in your introductions, which is fantastic. But here's the question that actually, when I looked at all the questions I wanted to ask, is one of my favorites. So you're at a cocktail party, you're at a dinner party, maybe you've moved into a new neighborhood, or somebody's moved into your neighborhood, and they're chatting with you, and they say, "Oh, what do you do?" And you have to explain to someone what it is you do. I'm dying to know, how do you describe your job? I'm going to start with you, Elise.
Well, first of all, it's a fantastic career to be in for any sort of, interaction or meeting people, because it's such a fascinating job that it never disappoints in a conversation. So I usually tell people I work in an IVF lab. And we're the ones that are creating embryos for people who are trying to start or grow their families or preserve their fertility. That's usually what I start with. And then there's like 100 questions from there.
Yeah. Right. So it's really, you got it down. You got that down. Dr. Alikani, you've been doing this a while. How do you describe your job?
Yeah, I usually start by saying that I help people have children. And it really usually intrigues people to ask more questions.
Oh, yeah.
And then they say, well, what do you mean? And I say, well, I'm a clinical embryologist. I work in an embryology laboratory where we handle eggs, sperm, and embryos with great care. And we collect eggs, we assess their quality, we perform microsurgery on these eggs and embryos, and we freeze them, we thaw them, and we are ultimately responsible for getting the embryo into the uterus. And then we sit at the edge of our seats for about 2 weeks until we get a pregnancy result. Then we sit again, maybe in the middle of the seat, while we wait for the fetal heart activity results for another 2 weeks. And then, of course, we take very measured breaths until we get the news of a healthy delivery. So, great. You know, people are very intrigued by this.
I bet it. Yeah, I'm certain. Well, those are both of you, the way you first phrased it, I think it would absolutely elicit, wait a minute, I need to ask more questions about this. So you both have touched on this. So is there anything else that you haven't already shared about what actually happens in the embryology lab? This is the big question that we got. What goes on behind there? And you both have already shared, quite a bit. Dr. Alikani, is there anything else that you would tell somebody about what happens in the embryology lab?
Well, one thing I do want to say, and this is very important, is that we also have an andrology laboratory, and we cannot forget about that, because the equation is egg plus sperm gives you embryo. So the sperm is half the equation, and it shouldn't be forgotten. So the andrology laboratory is where we assess and process semen or testicular tissue or epidermal aspirations, and we try to get a highly selected sperm sample that we use then to inseminate oocytes or eggs. And so obviously that's an integral part of the whole process. And I think in terms of what else is done in the embryology lab, I think it's the intensity of what we do, dealing and managing and help and actually manipulating human eggs and embryos and sperm is the most impressive part, I think, of what we do in embryology.
Elise, is there anything else that you'd like to add about what happens in the embryology lab?
Yeah, I was going to mention that, you know, while the technical procedures are so important, a lot of our time is spent setting up for procedures, cleaning the lab, making sure our equipment is running properly, filling out paperwork and doing admin things, answering patient questions. So there's a lot of other things that happen in the lab that aren't just procedures, aren't just working with embryos. We really want to make sure our whole culture environment is, you know, the best it can be for these embryos, as well as, you know, there's a lot of important paperwork that has to be done and regulations that we have to follow. So that's another part of that process.
Absolutely. I know that you guys, labs are inspected and have to comply with a lot of different federal and state regulations and so forth, and professional guidelines. So yeah, I appreciate that. Wow, I'm already going, okay, I thought I knew everything that was going on, but you both have added a whole bunch to my list. Speaking of, what about the biggest challenges that embryologists are facing today? Either one of you, jump in.
So if I may, I'd like to point out three challenges that in my mind are very substantial challenges for us. The first thing is from the point of view of human resources that are required to fulfill this truly, you know, profound set of responsibilities. And that is mitigating stress and preventing burnout.
Oh, wow.
Which is really, this is a great segue, because we just finished talking about how many things actually have to happen in the embryology and andrology laboratories, and what a highly regulated industry ART actually is. And this is despite the impression that is out there that our field is not regulated. So preventing burnout and preserving the stability of the laboratory and reducing turnover is a big challenge for us. And
I was going to mention the same thing. A lot of the labs I've been in as a traveling embryologist are very understaffed. I mean, to be able, it takes a lot of time to train another embryologist.
That's right.
And that takes your time away from the procedure. So I know there is a big problem in the field with keeping lab staff and having enough lab staff because there is a lot of burnout, and the demand for embryologists is really high. So it can often cause more burnout because, you know, there are times where labs can be understaffed and things like that. And really making sure the leaders of the clinic that have some influence realize how important it is for a lab to be adequately staffed and that we're following staffing guidelines.
Absolutely.
So, and then just moving forward from a technical point of view, I think we have two major challenges. One is embryo selection. You know, over the past 4 decades that I've been, nearly 4 decades that I've been involved in this work, we have been able to improve ART outcomes significantly, while we have drastically reduced the rate of high risk, you know, twin, triplet, and even higher order multiple pregnancies. This has been mainly a result of innovation and improvements in the laboratory.
Wow.
I have to say that. And for example, think the highly efficient vitrification technologies for cryopreservation of eggs and embryos. You can think about development of the new generation of culture media for safely keeping embryos in the laboratory for 7 days. Okay, we could not do that in 1983. We could not even do that in 1990. barely. So, these have been improvements. There is incubation technologies that have been introduced and have made a tremendous difference in the way we culture and grow human embryos in the laboratory. We now have time-lapse technologies. We can see development of the embryos from moment one until the moment we transfer them to the uterus. This was not possible before. So, there's also pre-implantation genetic testing. We can now select embryos based on the chromosomal integrity. And we can even now tell the origin of a chromosomal abnormality, whether it originated in the sperm or the egg.
Wow.
I mean, it's amazing how far we have come. But this issue, of selecting a single embryo that we know for certain that will implant and will give us a baby in the end, is still a challenge.
I'm glad you brought that up, because you both know the work that Resolve does, and we do a tremendous amount of work where we are talking to legislators who are trying to pass a piece of legislation that might regulate what you two do each and every day, and we want to make that as the less burdensome as possible. We want patients to have all the rights to your care. And I say that to folks a lot, that we don't yet know this embryo is going to make a baby. And so it's interesting that you brought that up as one of the challenges, because I think people think that you can do that. And so on. Well, let me move on, because we have a lot to talk. I can tell right now. I want to sit and talk to you two for like 3 hours. So, Elise, you know firsthand, because you're on social media. You use that as a tool to educate, and you also know probably how misinformation can spread. And so, over the past few years, we've seen professionals jump into social media and help, honestly, do good and debunk a lot of these misconceptions. So you've been doing this now on social media for a little while. What's the biggest misconception that you've run up against in the field regarding the field of embryology?
Yeah. And I'm super thankful for all of the other creators out there that are also in the field. They provide fantastic information. But I would say that what I get the most from people is that IVF will guarantee them a baby. And that's really just not the case. We have, I've seen lots of patients who are on this journey for years and have done cycle after cycle, and eventually resolve their journey without a baby, and maybe decide to go a different route, or maybe decide to be childless. And, so I think that there is this big misconception that IVF is going to guarantee you a baby, and it's only going to take one cycle, and I'll be pregnant in a month, and that's often not the case. It usually takes, just to get into an IVF cycle and get to that transfer takes a good bit of time, oftentimes a couple months, and then there are lots of patients who have to do multiple cycles before they're able to even get an embryo or to get to a transfer. So it's typically a much longer process than I think people think about when they start the journey, or when they're thinking about someone else, in their journey. It's I think that comes with a lot of stress and anxiety, and guilt around the process, that they're not able to do this thing that seems to come so naturally to other people.
Yeah, but they have the wrong perception if they're thinking that everybody. I mean, this is just what you were saying, Dr. Alikani, where you were saying that we don't yet know. We have all this great technology, but we don't yet know that this embryo will produce. So it's very difficult to say to someone, it's only going to take one cycle, because that's just not the case. I couldn't agree more with what we hear at Resolve, that's, And I like to refer to it as a course of treatment. I say to people, you know, it's not a one and done. You should go into it with a different mentality, certainly. So Dr. Ali Khani, what do you see as the future of embryology? You were just talking about all these great advances that you've seen. What's the future?
Well, I think the future of clinical embryology, like many other areas in science and medicine, is automation and integration of artificial intelligence in the practices, daily practices. We have some aspects that have been automated, but this will continue into the future, and to a point where the concept of a lab in a box or that will become reality. Of course, we are a bit far from that, but it will happen incrementally, stepwise, that we will have automation of different aspects of the embryology processes and procedures as we move forward.
Is that something that is being looked at in a positive way and embraced? Because I can see that that would potentially eliminate any kind of errors or mistakes where you have sort of that machine or that AI. Or is this being viewed in any kind of negative way by the field?
Well, I think for the most part, positively, but skeptically in some respects. And exactly for the reasons you mentioned. I think that people are resistant to change, and it's difficult to accept new technology. And of course, new technology in a field like ART has to be proven to be efficacious. And that's not always easy to show. So people usually wait. They wait until the technology has been adopted by others and there's more evidence. And so, yeah, it's a positive for sure. But I think that people are cautiously optimistic that it will become more of a reality as time goes by.
Interesting. Well, as I said at the top of our time here, we polled and asked our social media community what questions they have. What would they love to sit down at a kitchen table and ask an embryologist? So I'm going to go through a few of these with both of you. Turns out that we have some aspiring embryologists in our community. And so people wanted to know, how do you become an embryologist? What is your background? So Elise, I thought that would be such a great question for you. Tell us a little bit about how somebody becomes an embryologist and gets a job.
Yeah, I love that question. I actually, when I started my accounts, I was gearing them towards patients, but I wasn't expecting this kind of new wave of embryologists to come through.
So you're getting it too on your channels. Wow.
I answered a question this morning actually about someone asking that. So I wasn't expecting that, but I'm loving that it's bringing so much light to a field that really has some good demand. So what I typically tell people, CLIA 88 requires that high complexity lab staff have a minimum of 24 hard science credit hours. Those are your classes like chemistry, biology, biochemistry, those sorts of courses. And most bachelor's degrees in a science will get you those requirements. So I often say, most embryologists have at the very minimum a bachelor's of science in a science, science major. So mine was genetics, biology, chemistry. Any of those majors will get you those required courses. Now, there are some different requirements depending on the state. I know New York State is one, Florida as well, that requires some different licensure. But some of the other states don't require any other additional certifications. Now, it's always great to get those. You know, there's technical certifications you can get and things like that, but those are not always required. My introduction into the field was, you know, I physically just reached out via email to all of the clinics in my area and said, hey, can I come shadow? Can I come see what you do? I'm interested in this field. Do you have time for an informational interview? You know, anything you can do to, you know, to get that foot in the door. And I was able to shadow for a while, and then a position opened up like right as I was graduating. So the timing was great for me to get a foot in the door in andrology. A lot of embryologists start in andrology, which is sperm testing, semen testing, and there's often some endocrinology blood work in there as well. And then I came from a very small lab, so I was able to train my way into embryology. And so that worked out really well for me. It took me about 2 years to finally get into the embryology lab, but I loved it. It was essentially like I was getting paid for you know, a graduate degree. That's how I felt, is like, oh my gosh, I get to learn all these things every day and, you know, further my knowledge and training. And so that's great. And, you know, there's a couple other organizations that have training programs. You know, there's some master's programs and just, you know, 10 and 12-week programs that can get you some skills that may be able to get your foot in the door in some of those labs.
Wow, that's great. Dr. Alikani, I forgot I had a question for you that actually is from me and not our patient community. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions. So I want to hear a little bit about cryo management protocols and the technology that has, because you were talking so much about all the different technologies, and I wanted to know, how has it changed how we track and store and care for frozen eggs and embryos? Tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you for that question, because actually that was the 3rd challenge I was going to mention before.
Oh, good.
And, you know, the 3rd challenge is cryo management, because IVF laboratories were not really designed to be repositories. And so because of the enormous success of vitrification and the fact that vitrification freezing
is the process of freezing. Yeah.
Freezing, right? Ultra rapid freezing of eggs and embryos. We've been so successful at it that the field is now fully dependent on this technology. So every patient practically, or a very high percentage of our patients will have some freezing of eggs, sperm, or embryos. And so we have to manage storage of these, cryo storage of this material, precious material, at very low temperatures. We have tanks that maintain the temperature at something like a minus 300 and something degrees Fahrenheit, minus 196 degrees centigrade. And so all of this material has to be maintained, tracked. The record keeping becomes a major issue. And interestingly, you know, while cryopreservation or freezing technologies have gone through a revolution, cryomanagement hasn't really kept up. You know, and that is an area where we need a lot of help. And luckily, the startup company Tomorrow, TMRW, Tomorrow Life Sciences, is really changing this. And they have successfully tackled it and developed a very unique automated software-guided system to manage cryostorage. And the system uses robotics and RFID, which is radio frequency identification technology that ultimately reduces the chances of errors and improves both safety and efficiency, because as Elise mentioned, there's so much administrative work that has to be done in conjunction with cryo storage. And obviously, we want to keep this material as safe and secure as possible. And I think that the tomorrow technology makes that possible. And what I would say is that the tomorrow system is a much needed innovation that really holds great promise to revolutionize cryostorage, just as vitrification has revolutionized cryopreservation.
Wow. So it's sort of this iteration. You talked about all these different technologies and improvements to the process as we continue to improve. This one is about management, which doesn't sound real sexy. Like, patients are probably like, I don't care. I think it's really cool to learn about freezing and how you grade an embryo and all of that, but how it's stored has not necessarily been at the top of their mind.
Exactly.
But it's you're right. I mean, just the physical space that clinics have don't know necessarily. And we know of companies where you can ship embryos to offsite kind of storage and that sort of thing. And so it's important. And we certainly at Resolve advise patients to know more about how their gametes are being stored and how that's being done, because it's important. It's important for patients to ask those questions and to understand where those precious specimens are,
yes,
and how they're being cared for. Well, let me just then go to our community, Dr. Alikani, because I want to ask you, while you're talking about that, we got lots of questions about freeze criteria. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't even know what they're trying to get at there, but what are the questions? How would you answer that in terms of from a patient perspective? And we got to keep it in layman's terms.
Sure, absolutely. So this really varies among different labs. But if I were to, because it's not standardized, but if I were to speak very generally, I would say that we essentially can freeze embryos at any stage of development, from day 1 through day 7 of development in culture. Okay. We're able to do it, they survive, and they do well. Okay. But typically today, freezing is done on day 5, 6, or 7 of development, when the embryo is called a blastocyst. And a blastocyst is graded based on more or less what is its size, and that size is given a numerical value between 1 and 6, and the status of its hatching, which we might talk about later, and 2 other grades that are alphabetical, and they refer to the quality of the inner cell mass, which gives rise to the fetus, and the trophectoderm, which gives rise to the placenta. So we have A through C to reflect the quality of these 2 very important tissues within the blastocyst. And we typically freeze embryos that are between 2 or 3 and 6, and we freeze mainly embryos that have a grade of A and B. But we occasionally freeze embryos that have a grade of C, depending on the embryo and the circumstances.
Got it. So Elise, maybe you could walk us through anything else on that grading process and how you all do that in the lab. This is those grading of the embryos, and are there different methods of that? And what do you tell a patient in terms of what the grade is of their embryos, and then what does that mean to them?
Absolutely. This is by far my most asked question.
There you go.
Yeah, like top asked question. And I think it's because that information that Dr. Alikani so very well explained, is often not given to patients while they're going through the process, just because there's, like I said earlier, there's so much information. And so physicians can't always give all of the information. It's unrealistic. So that is, like I said, by far my most asked question. And I think for the most part, patients just want to know that they have a good quality embryo, that the embryo that was frozen is more likely to make a baby than the embryos that weren't frozen. And what I typically tell people is, if the embryologist froze that embryo, they think that it's worth transferring. They think that it's worth a shot, and is more likely to make a baby than maybe some of the other embryos that got discarded. And so I think when patients have this stress over their embryo grades, I think a lot of it comes from lack of knowledge on why we grade and how we grade. And they just want some confidence that they have something that's worth being transferred. And so that is definitely a very, very commonly asked question. And, you know, that is pretty much the standard for grading. Every so often I'll get someone who asks me a question about a different grading standard, and I'm like, oh, I'm not really sure about that. You know, that's not the standard that I'm used to. You know, you may want to reach out to your clinic. And I really just believe a knowledgeable and informed patient is an empowered patient, a patient that's able to advocate for their care. And so I'm always, ask your clinic if you have a question. It's worth fighting for the answer to that question.
Right. You know, you brought up something that you said, if it's not going to be frozen, you know, if it's being frozen, excuse me, then that means that there's a possibility that is, you know, will result in a future baby, because at the end of the day, that's what patients are looking for. That leads me to believe that not every embryo, you know where this is going, every embryo is going to get to a point in those 5, 6, 7 days that gets to where we want it to be. And Elise, what do you tell a patient if that's the case with their embryos?
Right. So, you know, I often will relate it back to natural conception. Typically in a normal cycle, a normal healthy cycle, you're releasing 1, maybe 2, if you're getting, you know, fraternal twins, you're releasing 1 or 2 eggs a cycle. And in the IVF process, we are, you know, stimulating the ovaries to produce more than that. And not every egg will fertilize, not every egg will produce an embryo, even in natural conception. Mm-hmm. So we're essentially taking sometimes 2 years worth of cycles and combining them into 1 cycle. Right. And so, you know, I think that's another place where there can be some misconceptions that, you know, all of those all of those eggs that are retrieved are going to create embryos, and then create babies. And that's typically not the case. There's usually a lot of eggs and embryos that kind of, you know, don't develop over those 5 or 6 or 7 days. And it's, you know, it can be due to a lot of reasons. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we may see something. A lot of times it's genetic issues with either the egg or the sperm, because human nature is not 100% perfect, unfortunately. So there's often errors in DNA and things like that can cause some developmental, you know, arrests in embryos, and can cause them to not develop as we'd like them to.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Alicani, one of the other questions that we got, a lot of people were asking, you mentioned this earlier, embryo hatching.
Yes. So
what is that, and when is it best to use that embryo hatching?
Okay, so eggs and embryos are surrounded by a non-cellular coat called the zona pellucida. And as they go through development, this coat is maintained until they reach the blastocyst stage and advanced stages of the blastocyst stage. When this coat has to be shed, they have to escape from the coat or the zona pellucida in order to be able to implant in the uterus.
Okay.
So assisted hatching is a process by which we introduce an artificial hole in the zona pellucida using a laser in order to facilitate hatching.
Got it.
Right?
Got it.
So currently, really, there's no time to go backwards. So I will talk about where assisted hatching is today.
Okay.
Today, assisted hatching is being used for essentially two purposes. One is to allow access to cells in the blastocyst for biopsy. So we have to take a few cells out for pre-implantation genetic testing. And in order to be able to do that biopsy procedure, we have to have access to the cells. And the zona pellucida would be a barrier. So we need to open the zona pellucida in order to do a biopsy. So that's one application of assisted hatching. And for that purpose, it can be done on day 3, day 4, or right before the biopsy on day 5 or 6 or 7. The second use of assisted hatching is for frozen thawed or vitrified warmed embryos or embryos that were generated using vitrified oocytes right before transfer, post-warming or thawing. So after we thaw or warm the embryo, we do assisted hatching before the transfer in order to make sure that this embryo will be able to escape the zona pellucida in order to implant in the uterus.
Wow, wow. It's incredible, incredible. So I got a last question for either one of you, and then we're gonna start to wrap up. We get this, I actually get this a lot from the media. How long can embryos be frozen?
So yeah, theoretically, indefinitely. There is really no physical or biological reason for us to believe that the quality of eggs and embryos or sperm deteriorates over time. Okay. in cryo storage. Okay. Okay. So the oldest frozen embryo that has led to a live birth is, I think, 25 years. And for eggs, I think it's 12 years. Okay. So we have evidence that it can work, and we also have lots of publications that show the length of cryo storage does not impact outcome.
Okay. There you go. There you go. Elise, yeah. I got one for you here. You're very active on social media. You use your platform to help others and educate others. Is there any time that, because you've already talked about the question you get most often, is there a question that you've gotten that's like stumped you, that you're just like, where did this come from? I hate to ask you to admit to that, but no. I am sure that there are, I've always thought that patients in this space were pretty savvy. So
no, and they are. And I really feel like any scientist that claims they know it all is not a true scientist, because there's so many things that are coming up in research that we don't always know. And that, you know, like Dr. Alikani mentioned, sometimes it takes a while for these things that are coming out in research to make it to the clinical setting, because a lot of clinics want to make sure that that research is very sound before they're implementing it and advocating that their patients use it. So there have been plenty of times that patients ask me something and I'm like, oh, I've never heard of that. You know, I have no problem admitting that, because I do not claim to know everything. And I don't want to, you know, spread any sort of misinformation. So when those questions do come, I try to revert them back to their clinic. Talk to your clinic about it. This may be a new technique that they're using. The most recent one I've gotten is this gold media that I've been asked about it a couple times. And, you know, I try to do my own research on it, and I'm like, I'm not seeing much about it. And, you know, I go to other clinics and I'm like, have you heard of these things? And
this is from a patient? This is from a patient.
This was from a patient. And I eventually went back to the patient and I was like, what is this? Ask your clinic, because I want to know. I haven't heard of these things. And it turned out it was a type of culture media that wasn't necessarily something that was advertised as culture media. It was omnitrope that they were using as in conjunction with some embryo culture that they were doing, and had named it gold media. So I learned from patients all the time. And really I have gotten a lot of information from them and been able to look into things I had never heard of. And so it's really furthered my education as a scientist and embryologist.
Fantastic. Well, it's been such a pleasure. I've learned some things, but I've also just been so in awe of both of you and your passion and your enthusiasm. I am certain that any patient that comes in contact with either one of you is just is going to have the best care. So I appreciate you both being here. Dr. Alikani, you also are on the scientific advisory board with Tomorrow, one of our sponsors and partners with Resolve. Elise Daniels, we can find you at a couple of places. Your online handle is at Elise the Embryologist, which is great. But you also have a website, which is elisetheembryologist.com. So I really appreciate both of you and your thoughtful conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. For those of you who are new to Resolve, I invite you to check out our website, resolve.org, and you can find us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. If this content is helpful, we are a charitable organization and we would so appreciate your support. We have been around a long time because of the generosity of this community and in supporting our cause. I want to thank our head of the table sponsor, Granada Bio, once again, and our guest sponsor, Tomorrow, for sponsoring this great conversation. Thank you again both, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.